Greetings, I'm Yvonne Stapp for Science for the Public, and I welcome you to our Contemporary Science Issues and Innovations program. Today, our topic is the looming global water crisis. Our guest is Jay Famiglietti, Global Futures Professor at Arizona State University, where he is also the Director of Science for Arizona Water Innovation Initiative. I don't think anyone knows more than Dr. Famiglietti about the global water crisis, how it happened, how will it affect the availability of drinking water, water for agriculture, and so forth across the planet, and what must be done to restore the fresh water. We're delighted to welcome by Zoom Dr. Jay Famiglietti to explain the situation. Dr. Famiglietti, thank you so much for joining us today. What is the importance of fresh water? Since considering that the planet has so much water, what's the importance of the fresh water?
Well, we wouldn't be here without water. Water is, of course, essential for life, but when we think about the role that water plays, it does many, many things, and we need it as humans. We need it for many things. So, first of all, within the Earth system, and when I say Earth system, I mean how the ocean and the land and the atmosphere all interact together. Mm-hmm. Within the Earth system, it's a vital cycle that helps move heat around the Earth, helps keep the Earth at a habitable temperature. But on a more practical level, we need it for our daily lives. We need it to grow food. We need it to produce energy. Of course, we need water for the environment. And just about anything we want to do economically requires water. So without water, it's fair to say we would not be here.
Now, that's water in general, but fresh water is what you're, I think, really alluding to, that we need it to stay alive. And since there's so much water on the planet, then why isn't fresh water abundant, or how much of the water available is fresh water? Maybe I should say that. Is it just a tiny percentage?
Sure, yeah, it's only about 3%, and most of it is locked up in the ice sheets. And so there's actually just, sort of a percentage of the total water on the planet, including salt water and fresh water. And even much of that is in deep groundwater, which gets harder and harder to get to because it's stored in aquifers, soil and rock units that are below the ground. So, we have access to surface water in rivers and lakes and the reservoirs that we build. And when that is not enough, then we drill wells and we access the groundwater. But it's a tiny percentage. And we generally, in many parts of the world, use more water than is available, that's being renewed every year by precipitation, by rainfall and stream flow that might flow into a region.
I see. So the water comes from a lot of it underground, and I guess also in ice form and so forth. But in any case, we're running out of it, the fresh water, and we need it, and we sort of have a crisis. Could you explain the crisis to us? Like, what is the crisis at this point?
Yeah, so, the water crisis is very, very complicated. And it's not just about water scarcity, and it's not just about water contamination and pollution. Those are important elements. But sometimes it's a crisis of management. It's a crisis of governance. It's a crisis of water security. Governments may not really have a desire to provide water to its population. So it's quite nuanced. We tend to think about the water quality and the water quantity, and those are huge, but there are these other elements. Poor nations, developing nations, for example, don't necessarily have the money to build the infrastructure to protect themselves from floods or to store water and to even build reservoirs.
Right, I see. And so it is a global problem now, is that correct? I mean,
is
obviously,
absolutely
yeah,
it's absolutely a global problem. There is no
yes.
place on Earth that is untouched by the global water crisis.
Okay,
None.
okay. And could we get an idea of like what, how much do we need? And I'd also like to ask in terms of the problem behind there, what we use it for. We obviously drink it and so on, but it's big for agriculture too. Is that right?
Agriculture is the biggest use of water on the planet, and that makes sense because we have to eat. About 80% of
Wow.
the water that we withdraw from rivers or lakes or reservoirs or groundwater is used to grow food.
I see. So we're using it up too rapidly, I take it. That is, we've had enough water in the past and now we're really in crisis. We're
Well,
just using it
yeah.
up too
So let
fast?
me just. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, we're using it up too fast, and then are there other causes?
Yeah, it's things have really changed over the past few decades. And one of those is, of course, climate change, and that's changing the amount of precipitation that comes into a region. In many places, we're getting less. In many places, we're getting less snow because it's warmer. And snow is really important water source in many parts of the world because it sits up in the mountains, basically like an extra reservoir. It sits up there frozen and then sort of trickles down in the springtime. Um, and because of the increasing heat, we have higher evaporation. So in many places, we have less coming in, more going out through evaporation. And so the surface water, so I'm sort of gesticulating here about the water cycle, the amount of rainfall and evaporation, that's the balance of that is decreasing. And that means that we are trying to use more groundwater in many places around the world. And groundwater turns out to be unregulated in most parts of the world, so that it's become kind of a free for all in many parts of the world. That there's not enough surface water that's being supplied by rainfall and snowmelt. So we turn to more groundwater. Groundwater is unregulated. We overpump, and that's a huge element of this crisis. That's a management and policy crisis.
And that is a really important thing that there seems to be, it's not regulated somehow to share this resource, evidently. Very quickly, though, what, roughly the percentage of the world that is really affected by this? I know we have places in the United States even, but in the world, can you give it an idea, like the percentage of the population that's affected by this?
There are many, many different ways to characterize that. We have a paper that's in review. As scientists, we have to have our papers peer reviewed.
Yeah.
But so this paper is in review. So this is a new study we've done, and we found that over the last 22 years, I think it's about conservatively 70% of the population
Wow, of the
lives in a
world.
country that has lost water over the last 22 years,
And
since 2002.
wow. And a lot of that is due to climate change? Do you think it is?
Well, it's all the things that we've talked
Yeah,
about.
yeah,
Climate change is a huge component because
right.
it's changing the availability of water. But then there's this issue of the lack of management, not just in the United States, but
Right.
around the world, lack of management of groundwater. So it disappears. The thing about groundwater is that much of it was deposited during the last glacial period. So over,
Right, right,
15,000 years
yeah.
ago and later. Um, and we're burning through it in about 100 years, so it's not going to be replaced. So there's many elements to it, and that's the whole idea of sustainability is trying to
Yes.
figure out in a region or in a country, in a state. I used to live in Canada, in a province or in a watershed or
Yeah.
whatever your unit is. It could be a county, it could be a city, it could be a water management district. trying to figure out how to get by with what you have.
Right. Yeah.
And those are, tough decisions have to be made, because then you have to begin allocating, okay, we'll give this much to agriculture, we'll give
Yeah.
this much to development, we'll leave this much for the environment. And that's really, really challenging.
Right, and that is the next question. What kinds of actions do we need here to address this situation? You work on this a lot. What would you recommend there in terms of actions for local, national, international, whatever? And I hope we've got it clear that, there's a lot of grabbing of this resource, but nobody seems to be in control. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, so, a few things come to mind. We always need better management. Sorry, no, we always need better measurement, and we need better access to those measurements. Imagine, just think about the United States and all the different agencies that have a hand in water. They're making measurements of stream flow, of rainfall, of evaporation, of groundwater at different times in different places. They're accessing it, or they're archiving it in, literally thousands of different websites. So pulling that all together and making a commitment to maintaining the measurements is really, really important, because that fundamental management slogan, you can't manage what you don't measure. So we have to have those measurements, those observations. But we also need to start thinking about, in the United States, I think we do a very good job managing our surface water, and we certainly do across the big river basins, although right now Colorado River Basin is a little bit of a challenge. But the groundwater part is the part that I think needs a lot more attention. And again, the groundwater is the water that is stored under the ground in rock and soil units that we call aquifers. It needs to be pumped out, and it's this component of the water cycle that has kind of slipped through the cracks. Mm-hmm. So we need better management within states. We don't do very much, if any, interstate discussions about groundwater, even though the aquifers themselves may span state boundaries. And we also need to integrate it into international discussions as well, and even think about, water and groundwater as an important part of the COP discussions, the UN, FCCC, the Framework Convention for Climate Change, the COP climate meetings, are places where water needs to be discussed, and it's kind of a second banana compared to carbon. And so that's something that we work on, is trying to elevate the discussion, elevate that dialogue regionally, right, in our different states. Yeah, I'm doing that here in Arizona, nationally and globally.
Right. That's a really serious thing, I think. One example is California, I think, which is a huge agriculture state, and it's running out of water, and some areas of it, I think, are really in crisis. And are there controls? Are there regulations there where these gigantic farms cannot just take all the water they want? Is there anything there to control this?
Yeah, in 2014, so excellent point, first of all, that California produces something like 25% of the food that shows up on American dinner tables. And it does it primarily using water just from California. Mm-hmm. And as you mentioned, that water is actually, over the long term, will run out if we don't take action. It's been in decline for decades. And so we have to figure out a sustainability plan. So actually in 2014, California passed the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, which split up the state into a number of different subunits, which we call groundwater basins. And each groundwater basin has to form a sort of governing body called the Groundwater Sustainability Agency, and each agency needs to write a groundwater sustainability plan. They have to be approved by the state. That process is ongoing. And then they have about 20 years to come into compliance. So I really like the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. It allows for what we call a lot of local control. The different smaller sub-agencies can define their own plans. Um, and I think, the jury is out, though, because it's such a long time horizon
Yeah,
for
right, right,
implementation.
right.
We're looking at, the mid 2040s or,
Yeah, yeah.
2050 before we do an assessment. So I think the jury's out on whether it's going to work.
Right. I was struck by your mention of how long they give for them to comply, and they're clearly in crisis already, so I'm not sure how that works, but it seems to be a global problem. And that brings me to these huge organizations like UNESCO and IPCC and Global Commission on Water and so on, and they don't seem to be able to get this under control. Could you give us an idea why? Why isn't anybody paying attention? Or why are they not complying?
I don't know if you noticed my heavy sigh.
Right.
I don't know the answer. I think that what I said a little bit earlier, I think there's a lot of attention to fossil fuels and the energy
Yes.
transition. And when you go to these international meetings, especially the COP meetings, that's the focus. I think that there is, one of the things that I try to do is write the research papers and then communicate through venues like this. I mean, I'll go to my local church, or I'll, try to write an opinion piece in the New York Times. I will do what it takes to communicate and educate. And so that's part of the solution, I think, is much more strategic, consistent messaging, translating our data into stories and narratives that really make sense for a particular region. It's one thing to go in and say, hey, California's running out of water. What should the United States do about it? It's another thing to say, California has a huge groundwater problem. And here's what that means for the lack of availability for fruits and vegetables. You're no longer going to have
Right, right.
fruits and vegetables in the wintertime. And when you do, the price is going to be 5 times what it is today.
Yeah.
That hits home.
Yeah, I hope so. And you still need to get the authorities to do what is necessary. And you brought up like the COP conferences and so on, that in spite of this, and they are overwhelmingly concerned with the fossil fuel issue and so on, but still nothing happens year after year after year. And the same applies here to the water crisis. And so it really is concerning that nothing is happening. Can I ask a couple of things too, for like, they bring up other kinds of sources, like we can do desalination, which I think might be problematic, but I'll ask you if you could explain that. And then I'll ask another one about the intrusion of seawater into the freshwater underground resources along coasts, which is happening as with sea level rise. So the two things there. First of all, the idea that, oh, well, that's all right, there's lots of ocean water, we'll just do desalination. Can you say anything about that, what it is, for one thing?
Well, I wish that were a simple solution, but it's not. So
Right.
desalination is exactly what it sounds like. We take water from the ocean and we remove the salt. And so it sounds simple enough, but there are many problems with it. One is that it's really, really energy intensive.
Yeah.
To extract that salt from the seawater. And so that makes it very expensive. And then the third thing is you are left with this salty brine that needs to be disposed of.
Oh dear.
And currently, the many places are just throwing it right back in the ocean, and that's not good. That's quite toxic to fish. It will lead to the destruction of our coastlines and coastal environments. And so, that is what you see in places like the Persian Gulf, where the
Yes,
quality of the water is really
yes, yes.
is really in decline. So, I think it's okay in limited amounts, but we have to solve the energy problem and we have to
Right.
solve the brine disposal problem. I think that they're solvable. I do, but it needs work.
Yeah, but what I have seen is that it doesn't really scale up adequately, but you pointed out this very important thing that it leaves a mess that
It
is
it it
polluting.
does. And you're right. It's very, very expensive, and
Yeah,
it doesn't really scale up. And we will end up destroying the ocean if we have desalination plants, every kilometer up and down every coast. That will be the end of the
yeah,
ocean.
yes,
So
thank
there's
you.
that.
Thank you for telling us about that. And the other problem is that as the oceans rise, as the sea level rises, apparently there is an intrusion into the underground water on land along the coast. Is that true?
That's true, and that's called seawater intrusion or saltwater intrusion, and it's exacerbated by sea level rise, but it was happening before we even understood that sea level was rising, and that has to do with pumping in coastal regions. When you pump groundwater, I used to live in Orange County, um, and it was a huge problem there. When you pump groundwater near the coast, it changes, without getting too technical, it sort of changes the flow patterns and it changes the pressure distributions such that rather than having groundwater acting as a barrier along the coast, the levels are too low,
Yeah,
the
yeah,
pressure fields change, and long story short, salt water starts flowing into the aquifer. And so this is a problem that is happening all over the world, and it needs to
yeah.
be combated. And the way that you combat it is you manage your pumping rates and you actually sort of build. This is what happens in Orange County and other places around the world. You actually inject groundwater to build sort of along the coast, uh, to sort of build up an underground dam. That's the easiest way to think about
Oh,
it. That blocks the seawater from coming in.
that's very interesting. So that's one possible solution. But in any case, we have this huge problem, and I know that you are a great communicator and have made great efforts to get this information out to the public and to our authorities who might be able to get around to do something to take care of the problem. I would like to ask in our last few minutes if you would talk about your work some. It really is extensive and we don't get to hear about this. Could you tell us some of the things about your work?
Sure, sure. Yeah, I think the last half of my career is really focused on using satellites to track how freshwater availability is changing around the world. And we use a particular satellite that allows, and it's called GRACE, the Gravity Recovery and Climate Experiment. GRACE is a joint NASA and the German Space Agency, which the initials are DLR. I won't try to say it in German. Uh, Gravity mission that allows us to sort of, see, make the invisible visible. That's a term we like to use in groundwater because it's underground. So think about it. It's really hard to use satellites to see underground. You really can't do it. And so with these gravity satellites, we're actually tracking weight loss. Okay. So I like to say that the satellites are like a scale in the sky. They respond to, so they're orbiting around the Earth. They respond to how mass is changing on the ground. And so if these satellites pass over a place like Arizona, where there's a lot of groundwater being pumped out, that region, or the California, Central Valley of California, that region is losing a lot of water weight. And the satellites then, the ground exerts less of a gravitational tug on the satellites, and so they move a little higher in their orbit when there's less water. And conversely, when there's more water, there's a greater tug, say a huge flood in the Mississippi Basin or
Yeah,
something.
yeah.
Satellites fly over, they're pulled down. And so it's like a scale. We keep track
Yes.
of the ups and downs. And by keeping track of the ups and downs, we're able to map out the regions around the world that are losing water mass on a monthly basis. And we've been doing it for 22 years. Um, and so we can look at the trends as well.
Wow, that's very impressive. And I know you've been at this work on just informing the public and everybody else the science of this, behind this freshwater, increasing freshwater crisis. And it's wonderful, and I hope you'll keep it up. And on that, I'd like to mention to our audience that on your website, you have, I think it's 3 Deutsche Welle, which is a German media, videos of you and your work, and it's really very good. And with your permission, I'll put the links to those on our event page for today, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
And I hope that you will be able to keep speaking. Do you have any ideas about what's the best way to get the word out? Is there some way? And especially in I hate to say it, but in this time in the United States, which is this growing anti-science and resistance to these kinds of problems, is there an effective way to communicate? What's your...
Well, yeah, I mean, we're trying to figure that out. And that's part of what I was talking about before with the narratives that are important to people. But, there's no silver bullet. And what I have found is that we do need to strategically communicate, but we do need to do it at every level. So, meaning from, locally, I live in Scottsdale, Arizona, which is just, gotten rid of its sustainability plan. So I need to go have some conversations. The state of Arizona, on the other hand, is willing to expand its groundwater management. So that's fantastic. And so we have conversations with them, and we have national conversations, and we have global conversations. And it's no one thing. We need a lot of people doing it. We need to keep doing this, so here's my strategy in a nutshell. Keep doing the science, keep training the students, keep it at the highest possible level, and then communicate, not just with myself, but, we've got teams of people that help us with communications. And so we talk to, the public. We write opinion pieces. We do documentary videos, like you mentioned. We write opinion pieces, and we travel to go to national, international meetings. So we're just trying to really band together as a coalition of scientists and government people and nonprofits. We call that transdisciplinary. So build transdisciplinary coalitions that can do the science and do the messaging across scales.
Yeah. And do you think you can get through to the authorities who have to make the policies and put them in place?
That is that's
the million-dollar
goal.
question, right?
That's the goal. And we don't know the answer, and that's why we say that it's a sort of high risk, high reward endeavor.
Right. Well, I think you are wonderful to keep at this work. I hope you will continue to expand your energy and resources like this. It is wonderful, and you're a great communicator. So thank you very, very much for joining us today, and best of luck.
Thank you so much. Really enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you.